Hello, and welcome to the Two Tall Jews Show.
We are the Two Tall Jews, and we are ready to go. We're each going to talk about our favorite posts of the week, mine being the two posts about the Inquisition, one of them talking about when it ended in 1834, thanks to Queen Regent Maria Cristina de Borbon of Spain, who 324 years after it began realized, maybe we should stop persecuting people that aren't Catholic. And it definitely came with the fall of the Spanish Empire. I think that, around 1834 was when they lost their Latin American colonies, who became independent. So I think that it was just the writing on the wall kind of thing, where it's like, maybe it's time to change the culture, the office culture in Spain. Portugal took a little bit longer. According to our other post, it ended in Portugal in Portugal ended earlier in 1821. So progressive of them. I think that in general we're going to be diving into the Inquisition deeper, on a deep dive. Hopefully, I do have a guest lined up that we can bring on, who's a professor in Israel in, I think, Tel Aviv University, who is an expert in the Converso community and the, Conversos being the Jews that were forced to convert, and who most likely were still practicing Judaism in the privacy of their home. What about you, Isaac? What post do you want to highlight for this week?
Can I highlight a post? Oh yeah, today's great. Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, so I want to highlight the post commemorating the beginning of the 2006 war with Lebanon. This is something that I remember very distinctly, sort of the summer going into sixth grade, that this was happening. And it's something that I've always wanted to know more about. And I think it speaks to a lot with regard to present Middle East history and Middle East geopolitics, having a firm grasp of whether Sharon's unitarily pulling all troops out of Gaza, or in the war with Lebanon. I just feel like it's, the IDF and Hezbollah butting heads is nothing new. And as far as our modern memory is concerned, that's a critical point.
You were 11 when the war broke out?
12.
You were 12. Okay, so then what about it as a 12-year-old though? Like what is, like, why did it impact you? What about it? Like, was it the headlines, or like?
It was the headlines. I think it was like multiple missiles going back and forth. And I remember vividly wanting to talk about it in my sixth grade humanities class, and going up to Betsy Schneck, fellow Jew. Don't know where she is now. Maybe she's listening. And I just spoke of it as a conflict. And she said, "Oh, you mean the war. You mean Israel's war with Lebanon." And, Weissman, when we had him on, he talked about how the nature of the rhetoric you employ in an argument says a lot about your stance on it. And sort of looking back on that, I look back on that small exchange of words differently than I had processed it when it had taken place.
Right. Yeah, I think that was a super interesting part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Where, that was a question that you kind of came up with in the moment, but, it does, when it comes to education, like, how does a person's own political viewpoint affect the way that they communicate?
Yeah.
Right? They always say, like, history is always written by the victor, but that's not necessarily true, because you can always find historical accounts from even the losers, like it's just a matter of doing the deep research that needs to be done in order to find those accounts. He brought up Darius Sin a lot as an example, because that's a perfect example. You have so many different accounts. It has turned into an event that's about advocating, and it's lost the aspect of educating, that perhaps Israel did mess up on that day, and that some people acted, the folks from the Lehi and the Irgun that acted on their own that day. So to an extent, maybe I'm advocating now, maybe I'm not educating so much right now, but it's okay, because I want people to know my bias, and I want and he talks about that too, where it's like, don't pretend like you don't have a bias. Bring out the bias, and then through that bias, now we can have an honest conversation about what this is, and you can make your own conclusions based off of the facts, right? And that's what we try to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think advocating is a part of educating. Yeah.
That's why he called it a spectrum, where it's like, it's not necessarily one or the other, but I do see Noam on one side of the spectrum, where I see Rudy Rachman on the other side of the spectrum. But if you ask Rudy, he'll probably tell you, I'm educating. I'm not advocating, because that's who he is. That's his personality. And so there's a fine line where, as the listener, as the consumer of information, it's on you to make those conclusions, whether or not I'm listening to an educator or an advocate, or both.
So turning our attention to anti-Semitism within the Hollywood and entertainment community. Now, Meir, as you know, we touched on this briefly in our emergency episode. However, there are some things that we have yet to shed light on, and a conversation that I'm looking forward to having with you. And I think that begins with the op-ed, or the piece that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote that ran in the Hollywood Reporter a couple of days ago, in which he called out the anti-Semitic activism, the sort of social justice anti-Semitism that we've seen demonstrated in certain entertainers such as Ice Cube, Dwayne Wade, Deshaun Jackson, Steven Jackson. But one of the things he does a really good job of articulating is how anti-Semitism has no place in the fight for social justice. And it's incumbent upon all of us who who need to be anti-racist in order to live in a just and civil society, to not fall into these widespread historical traps that include, belittling and, spewing anti-Semitism. And so I applaud Jabbar for his efforts, and he's been rather historically consistent with regard to standing up for the Jews and for all forms of religious and secular prejudice.
I don't want to dwell too much on it because we spoke about it. People can catch our emergency segment, and there's also that element of like when this first all started happening, and we were texting like, "Hey, should we talk about this?" And it's like, we literally said like, "No, let's not talk about it because we don't want to attract even more attention to it," and then we ended up talking about it. So I just thought that was ironic, but because it kept on being a thing and more, right? It started with Deshaun, and then it was Steven, and then it was Zach Banner defending, and then right. So Nick Cannon didn't make it. I think after Nick Cannon, we were like, all right, like now we have to talk about it, like, and I think that what frightens me more, and I saw there's been some accounts highlighting this. It's Diddy also, by the way, that's another one. These accounts with a major influence, major following, millions of followers, they have more followers than there are Jews in the world combined. And it's crazy. So when you put those numbers side to side, I feel small, and it's like, you ask yourself why are we still having the same conversations? why do I have to debunk the Elders of Zion, pamphlet?
No, I agree with you in the extent that a certain amount of discussion or over-discussion legitimizes the nature of these beliefs. However, given how it's not just a few people, it's now there's a sort of anti-Semitic bandwagon of sorts that I think is in need of condemning, and I think you agree. However, I just want to touch on, and I agree with you that we shouldn't spend the whole time talking about it, but I think there's a point to be made with regard to lack of education with regards to these issues. And I think it's telling that one of the most articulate and intelligent athletes of our time, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, is the one who's really sounding the alarm, saying, listen, anti-Semitism has no place in this discussion. This is ridiculous. And all of that is reflected in his great piece for The Reporter. So I think that, I don't think that it's a coincidence that you have these athletes and you have these entertainers who are not historically educated on issues of anti-Semitism. And as you said, it's a problem, not because they're dumb when it comes to these subjects, but because they're dumb when it comes to these subjects, and they have a big following that surpasses the people they're demonizing. So it's
absurd.
Yeah.
And what I was trying to get at was that, like, with those followers, when you look at the responses to, for example, like Nick Cannon came out with a pretty good apology. I'm not going to lie. His PR team did a good job of apologizing. But everyone in the response overwhelmingly was saying, why are you apologizing? Why does the black man need to apologize every time that he talks about the truth? Why are we apologizing about the truth? And this is like they're parroting the Louis Farrakhan BS that is not the truth. And again, I don't want to linger, and I think it was a good segue for you when you talked about being not historically educated, because when we speak about the word anti-Semitism, which is another point that has been brought up, that Nick Cannon said on his show, he literally said, I can't be an anti-Semite because I am a Semite.
Yeah, and he also said that he described black people as the true Hebrews. So that needs correcting for the record, and we're proud to bring that to you here at Two Tall Jews, or at least begin a conversation.
Yeah, I don't even want to begin to talk about that because it doesn't even deserve time. But I do want to talk about, when I say that, I mean that they are the true Jews. No, we can talk about it another time. I would need to prepare a little bit more to debunk it, but it's ridiculous. Yeah. What I do want to talk about is the word anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And its root, because it's relevant now, finally. Not finally, God forbid finally, but it's like this was going to be one of our first discussions when we were first starting the podcast, and it wasn't necessarily relevant in a way, and now it is, because I've been seeing it more and more, not just from Nick Cannon, also from different replies saying the same exact thing, can't be an anti-Semite because I'm Semite. So let's talk about that word, anti-Semitism.
Yeah. It
was invented in what year?
1878 by Wilhelm Meir.
Wilhelm.
W is pronounced as V's. In his 1878 pamphlet, The Victory of Judaism of Germandom. And I think I'm just going to sort of cut to the chase here. The most important thing to take away from this is that the term anti-Semitism has quote-unquote anti-Semitic or really sort of anti-Jewish origins. And the irony there is palpable. So we don't want anyone to be confused, any of our listeners to be confused and think that Wilhelm Meir was a lover of Jews or had Jewish friends or participated or wanted to aid in the development of Jewish scholarship. He was the opposite. And in fact, he wanted to codify the idea of Jews as a race. And the term anti-Semitism was the way in which he wanted to go about that. This idea of Jews, being a race, sort of this byproduct of 19th century Enlightenment thought, this idea of understanding Jews not as a religion, but as a certain sect of people.
By the way, isn't inherently anti-Jewish to say, but when you say it, because we ourselves call ourselves a people, and we ourselves consider ourselves as a separate nation, Am Kadosh, a holy nation, holy in Hebrew, Kadosh is translated as separate. So we don't necessarily disagree with that sense. It's when you apply these racial connotations that we are subhuman because of our Judaism,
right,
because of our ethnicity. Now we're talking about something else.
Right. And the term anti-Semitism was used to justify a kind of racial pseudoscience that previously did not exist and was not part of this national or cultural conversation. And if you want to look to other anti-Semitic incidents leading into the 20th century, and if you certainly want to hone in on Hitler, this idea of his racial pseudoscience draws directly from racial theory that developed in the United States and speaks to the kind of racial theory that was propagated by Wilhelm Meir in 1878. Mm-hmm. And so continuing to use the term anti-Semite and refer to anti-Judaism or Jewish hatred as anti-Semitism. How should it be labeled? That the way in which we employ language to talk about bigotry and religious bigotry and racial bigotry is important. And I think there's a very good argument that we should be employing the term Jewish prejudice.
Anti-Jewish.
Right,
anti-Jewish. Like the fact, this conversation is literally about the fact that the word anti-Semitism is anti-Semitic, isn't being spoken about, and it needs to be brought to light, because even within our community, there are arguments about how it's written. We argue about whether the S should be capital, whether there should be a hyphen, whether the S should be not capital with a hyphen, capital without. It's like,
it couldn't be more Jewish.
It couldn't be more Jewish, and it's also emphasizing that the fact that it's a confusing word, and it allows for a situation where somebody who is Semitic, because the word Semitic means inherently somebody who is from the African region, who either speaks Arabic or Hebrew. Who does that apply to? An African American who is a descendant of that region will naturally think, I'm a Semite, so I can't possibly be anti-Semitic. And it's like, no. And it's funny because even Jews can be anti-Semitic. So it's like, what are you talking about? Yeah,
your origins do not absolve you of being bigoted towards your own people.
Right. I mean, historically, one of the biggest anti-Semites, his name is Karl Marx. He was a Jew. He wrote things that even Hitler wouldn't have written about the Jewish people. He was such a self-hating Jew that it literally it took up more of his time. I think if he hadn't been such a hateful to his own origins, he probably would have written something a little more something a little smarter than what he came up with. He would have thought it out a little bit more. But then we just lost all our communist listeners. Isaac, do you hear that? It's the silence of the socialists. They're leaving the chat. Our sponsor is Best Shot Productions. Best Shot Productions. I don't have an ad read, but yeah, it's Best Shot Productions is a local video production company here in South Florida. They produce videos for your website, for your social media. You can check them out at bestshotproduction.com. And we are very happy to all full transparency. It's my dad's company. My dad, Henry Grunberg, it's a small company, and he wanted to be our first official sponsor. So maybe we'll come up with like an actual ad or something.
Moving on to our next segment. So last week we talked about we had a nice conversation about who we thought the most influential Jew in sports was. And today we want to turn our attention to politics and the history of past and present Jewish political figures. Meir, have you been a fan of a specific Jewish politician? I'm not going to, obviously you can say, an Israeli prime minister, so I'm not going to say that's a cop-out, but just like, Jewish politicians in general.
A Jewish politician in general, I'm going to have to say Golda Meir. Just finished reading her biography. Well, one of her biographies. There's multiple. The latest one called Lioness by Francine Klaxburn. And she does a really good job of sort of reframing Golda's life, because especially in Israel, she has a negative view of Golda Meir because of what happened after Yom Kippur. And Francine, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, which when you read the book, you realize that, Golda was definitely at fault. She was the prime minister. She, at the end of the day, she was making the decisions, but she was surrounded by groupthink that told her everything was okay. She was surrounded by generals that didn't do a good job of passing on information that needed to be passed on, or making decisions that needed to be made. They were also coming off of a major victory in 1967 that had the country literally on a high, we're never going to be defeated in the battlefield. Like, look at what we did 6 years ago. And the Arab nations knew that. They took advantage of that confidence. And everyone says it was a surprise attack, but, Israel, the Mossad pretty much knew. They let them know that it was going to happen. And the mistakes were made in not mobilizing properly. So I don't want to linger too much on Yom Kippur, but Golda's life was completely from day one indebted to building a state. She really was committed to the ideals of the labor Zionist movement. She grew up in the U.S. in Milwaukee, and she could have stayed here and had a nice, comfortable American Jewish life. And she said no. And in 1920, with her husband, who was not on board physically, he was on board physically, but not he didn't want to go. They went on a boat and they went to Israel in 1920, when it was still occupied by the British. There was no infrastructure. Tel Aviv was 10 years old. She went to work on a kibbutz, and she realized this isn't like I read, this is actually like real hard work, and I'm not necessarily as happy. But she kept going, and she, as a woman, was part of the first cabinet. She was part of major decisions. Thanks to her fundraising in 1948, she basically saved the state. She came to the U.S. She had an unbelievable ability to connect with American politicians and American Jewish donors because of her American background. So she was really good at both being a mother figure and a stern politician that stuck to her opinion and stuck to her gut. And she always said that Yom Kippur changed her forever. She would never be the same after that war, because it was the first time in her life that she didn't stick to her gut. Her gut told her, we have to preemptively attack, although the U.S. was telling her not to, so that was a little different. But her gut told her that something is wrong here, but she listened to her generals. And so she was forever changed because it not only changed her personality, but it changed the way that Israel was viewed. Lots of Israeli soldiers were killed in that war, and even though Israel ended up winning on the field, they lost. So, in short, I recommend that book, Lioness. It's a really good summary. Not summary. It's a really good history of Israel up until 1980, up until she passes away. And I couldn't recommend the book. More.
So let's move on.
Wait, that was just me. That was me. That was a
Meir,
go off on Golda.
Yeah, that was just impossible to follow. I have to,
Damn, dog. It's okay.
No, I really don't think Jews should be in politics, just in general.
I like that. Go on. Keep going.
I think they're better, like in Hollywood and in entertainment and as doctors and lawyers. I think that's sort of where we can find our control. No.
Yeah, we should probably limit. I mean, like one industry at a time, guys. Like, I mean, it's funny because I mean, in talking about like Jewish control though, like and Golda, like Henry Kissinger, he epitomized what it like the Jew that's controlling things like a puppeteer. Like, obviously, he was just Jewish by name, and there's a very famous interaction with him and Golda where he said, "Golda, I am first an American, then the Secretary of State, then a Jew," something like that, where like Jew was last. And she said, "Oh, Henry, don't you know? In Israel, we read in Hebrew, and Hebrew's read the other way." So it's it's one of her famous snarky comments, but yeah, I agree. I mean, in general, like we don't want to be in the spotlight because we're one tweet away from being accused of, controlling this or that, and people don't care about nuance. And
what I will say, actually, I'm going to use this as my opportunity. And this person is not a politician, but he is a person who has been politicized and in a world that and has power in a world that is political. So her decisions have political implications. And that person is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose cancer has returned, unfortunately. Say what you want about her politics. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been an instrumental force on the Supreme Court as part of the court's liberal judiciary. And at the age of 87, she is still as bright as the youngest members of the court. And she said that although her cancer has returned, she is going to continue to fight, and it will not affect her ability. It won't affect her ability to do her job. So we both wish her the best of luck and a speedy recovery.
Amen. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Two Tall Jews Show, presented by the On This Day in Jewish History Instagram account. If you're listening to us on any of the podcast apps, please hit the subscribe button, leave us a review, and let us know how we did. It means everything to us.
See you next time.